Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 20, Philip K. Dick. In the last episode, I talked about the new wave in sci-fi in the 60s. This was a time of new subject matter and new writing styles in the genre, and it was especially a time of new writers, with a lot more big names than you see in the golden age that preceded it. However, there's at least one writer of the new wave who deserves a full profile. There might be a couple others later, but few writers can compete with Philip K. Dick in his prolific output of well-known stories. Not necessarily widely read stories, although many of them are, but certainly widely watched stories. Dick has had more of his novels and short stories adapted into Hollywood films than just about any other sci-fi author besides Michael Crichton, and, depending if you count him, Stephen King. Along with the Man in the High Castle Amazon series, Dick's film credits include Screamers, Paycheck, Imposter, The Adjustment Bureau, Next, The Crystal Crypt, Minority Report, Total Recall, Radio Free Albemuth, A Scanner Darkly, and most famously of all, Blade Runner, which was based on his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Several of the other movies also had different titles in the originals, but they should be searchable either way. Philip K. Dick is also notable because, much like Alfred Bester, his writing is considered to be a forerunner to the cyberpunk movement of the 80s. But he goes a step further in that many of his most famous stories, like Blade Runner and Total Recall, were reimagined as cyberpunk films in the 80s. And they were so successful that today they're considered the archetype of cyberpunk. The original books have a fair number of those elements, though. The low-life/high-tech aesthetic of the subgenre, featuring virtual reality alongside widespread drug use, and grungy, bombed-out cities suffering under all-powerful, mega-rich corporate overlords. If you've seen Blade Runner, you probably get the picture. So it's good to take a closer look at him. Like many of the authors of the New Wave, Philip K. Dick grew up in a world where the big-name authors were already established. Instead of the earlier pulp stories, he began reading the sci-fi magazines in the early days of Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. He was still in high school when World War II ended, where he in fact graduated in the same class as Ursula K. Le Guin, although they didn't know each other at the time. He only attended one semester at college, at Berkeley, but it was still enough to befriend poets Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer. And after that, he worked at a record store for his day job while he tried to break into a career as a writer. Surprisingly, for someone who was so prolific as a sci-fi writer, Dick actually dreamed of a career in mainstream literary fiction, which at the time was much higher paying. He sold his first short story, Roog, to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1951, and sold his first novel, Solar Lottery, in 1955. But he actually labored for 10 years trying to break into the mainstream market. He eventually had to give it up when his agent sent back all his literary novels in 1963. This attitude is doubly surprising because Dick didn't write space opera, action-adventure type stuff. His sci-fi wasn't a fluffy side project to pay the bills, not to mention he struggled to make ends meet at several points. He dove deep into issues of humanity and identity. His books are rife with unreliable narrators, illusory worlds, and beings that blur the line between human and inhuman. He frequently portrays mental illness and altered states of consciousness. He draws heavily on Carl Jung, and Ursula K. Le Guin compared his themes to those of Charles Dickens. His writing was serious business, even though he didn't get much respect from the mainstream literature community. I'll be honest, I didn't care much for Philip K. Dick. I thought his writing style was, I don't know. It's always hard to parse exactly what makes writing good or bad in general, but Dick's was just not very good. Don't get me wrong, he had a great imagination. You don't get so many adaptations made of your works without creating captivating ideas and conveying them in at least a decent fashion. But down in the mechanics, it wasn't engaging to me, and I struggled to get through all 4 of his books that I read. And I'm not the only one who says this. Many sci-fi fans say that Dick was a bad writer. I've linked an article in the description from Ryan Britt of Inverse, which addresses this exact topic. In it, he quotes Anthony Ha of TechCrunch, who says of Dick, quote, "He often wrote too quickly, which meant that his style could be flat and unremarkable, with sentences and scenes that feel repetitive or shoddily constructed. And yet he could make a simple sentence carry a crazy amount of emotional weight. For example, I still think the opening of Martian Time Slip, quote, From the depths of phenobarbital slumber, Sylvia Bolin heard something that called, unquote, is a perfect introduction to that world, unquote again. I think flat and unremarkable is an apt descriptor of Dick's writing. At his best, he could certainly turn a phrase, but even at his best, he was inconsistent about it. The odd thing about Britt's article is that I feel like he hints at a conclusion that he doesn't quite reach, indeed one he recoils from, that Dick was sort of a poet. Not in that his writing style was poetical, it mostly wasn't, but there's something there. Consider Britt's interpretation of Stanisław Lem's opinion, yes, this is coming third hand, but it rings true to me, that Dick was, quote, using the trappings of science fiction to deliver stories about entropy, altered states, social and cultural disillusionment, unquote. This is the attitude of a poet, and Dick had befriended notable poets in his one semester of college. And you get that vibe of poetical metaphor when he uses turns of phrase like, from the depths of a phenobarbital slumber, or Sylvia ran laughing through the night brightness. Or look at the opening scene of A Scanner Darkly, which describes a prolonged drug-induced hallucination of a bug infestation. It's clumsily written, but it definitely sets the scene. In fact, maybe that's why Dick's stories have been so popular. He could set the scene well enough for it to shine through the clumsy writing. Unfortunately, this doesn't help the fact that, in my opinion, he wasn't a very good writer. Or you might say he was a great world builder, but not such a good storyteller. But who knows, maybe you'll enjoy his books more than I did. Let's look at some of these books and see what kinds of bizarre worlds Dick created. For myself, I read 3 of his most famous books that have had adaptations, The Man in the High Castle, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and A Scanner Darkly. And I read one more that frequently makes a list of classics, Time Out of Joint from 1959. Time Out of Joint is a mystery story, a theme that comes up a bit in Dick's other novels, but is front and center here. Regal Gum seemingly lives in an idyllic town in the real-life present of 1959, making a living using his uncanny ability to predict the answers in a newspaper contest. But strange things begin happening that suggest things aren't quite as they seem, such as when a soft drink stand disappears and is replaced by a slip of paper that reads soft drink stand. Actually, I'm not sure if that one was ever explained. Or when Regal finds a photograph recognizably described as Marilyn Monroe and has no idea who she is. Or the fact that nobody in town owns a radio. When Regal begins seeing the cracks in the facade, he investigates, slowly becoming aware that his world is not real. He then struggles to escape and solve the mystery of why he is in that place. And here already we can see the themes of unreliable narrators, altered perceptions, and things not being as they appear. It's tame by New Wave standards, perhaps still with one foot in the Golden Age, but you can definitely see the new styles showing through. The Man in the High Castle has been famous in recent years for the Amazon series based on it, and it was one of the earliest alternate histories depicting a future in which the Axis powers won World War II. Although the show has major differences. The original book is simply set in that alternate timeline, unlike the show, where characters travel between parallel universes. In The Man in the High Castle, the Axis powers took over America, partitioning it into the Nazi-occupied United States in the Northeast, a Vichy regime in the Old Confederacy, the Japanese-run Pacific States of America, and the still independent Rocky Mountain states as a buffer between the now competing superpowers. The actual Man in the High Castle himself is Hawthorne Abenson, author of the subversive book The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, which is itself an alternate history in which the Allies won the war, though not in the same way as the real world. No word on if it's grasshoppers all the way down. There's not an overarching plot as such. It's more of a slice-of-life story of ordinary people in the Pacific states struggling to get by as they're caught up in world events when Germany and Japan begin to turn on each other. That may be an additional weakness. Slice of life works better in a series, I think. However, I think the book is most hindered by the gimmick Dick used to write it. The I Ching, the Chinese divination method that so many characters used to guide their lives in the story, where it was described as a cultural import to Imperial Japan, was also used by Dick to write the book itself. The actual narrative is guided by it, which leads to the characters doing incongruous and sometimes confusing and contradictory actions. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but in my reading, the I Ching seems to be the cultural equivalent of letting a Bible fall open to a random page for guidance. It may be useful in its cultural context, but it's still a random number generator and won't do writing a novel any favors. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was the inspiration for probably the most famous Philip K. Dick adaptation, Blade Runner. The story is set in a future where the Earth is choked with radioactive dust. Most of the animals are dead, and the remaining humans are slowly dying. Those who can are encouraged to emigrate to space colonies, where they are given quote-unquote androids, biological robots used as servants, which are called replicants in the movie. Androids are almost indistinguishable from humans, something their manufacturer takes pride in, and they sometimes escape to Earth. And it's up to police officer and bounty hunter Rick Deckard to get rid of them. Earth is also home to a new techno-religion called Mercerism, which uses virtual reality in place of religious experiences, emphasizes empathy as the highest virtue, and encourages animal ownership to promote empathy, to the point where people who can't afford the highly endangered animals buy robotic animals to take care of, such as Deckard's electric sheep. And once again, the world building winds up being more complex than the actual plot, although the themes of the nature of humanity remain strong. This is sort of an odd case in the genre because it's not clear where the radioactive dust comes from, unlike many similar stories. There is mention of a recent nuclear war, but at the same time, the dust is described almost as if it drifted down from space, not from any specific location on Earth. It leaves you to wonder if there's some sort of conspiracy there. Also, the symptoms of this radiation poisoning aren't the usual, but seem to be primarily progressive brain damage. The psychological horror of this is barely explored. But throughout the book, there's this largely unspoken undercurrent where, even as Deckard is hunting down androids, which really do seem to lack empathy, making them dangerous sociopaths, the actual humans who fall victim to the radiation are looked down upon, even to the point of being regarded as borderline less than human. I think there's actually a lot of untapped potential there. Finally, there's A Scanner Darkly. Ugh. This is Dick's fictionalized autobiography and his most vivid take on the drug culture, looking back from his later life after his heavy use of amphetamines in the 60s finally caught up with him. And this is by far the hardest of the 4 Philip K. Dick novels that I read. I've heard it said, and it seems plausible, that A Scanner Darkly is a very significant and meaningful book if you're actually on drugs, but if you're not, it's not very relatable. It was slow and confusing and weird in ways that didn't do it any favors. It's certainly one of Dick's strangest novels, and it also has one of the strangest film adaptations, the 2006 rotoscoped film of the same name, starring Keanu Reeves as Bob/Fred. In A Scanner Darkly, Fred is a police informant turning evidence on drug dealers selling an extremely dangerous new drug called Substance D. But Fred's real name is Bob Arctor. Bob wears something called a scramble suit, one of the few truly sci-fi elements of the story, which hides his features so that not even the police know who he truly is. Bob himself is a dealer, being undercover and all, and living it up with his friends in the business. But his slow descent into drug-induced madness begins when he is given the name of his next target for surveillance, Bob Arctor. What follows is an increasingly psychedelic series of events as Bob begins to dissociate himself and Fred into 2 different people. Evidence of strange conspiracies comes to light, but it's never clear if they're real or if they're just inside his head. Eventually, though, it emerges that they go deeper than he ever imagined. I don't have much else to say about this one. All of these examples showcase Dick's common themes of personal identity, altered states of consciousness, and what he himself summed up as, quote, "what constitutes an authentic human being," unquote. But to go deeper into exploring these themes in his writing, you'll have to read them and judge for yourself. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available many places, including my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com, where you can also see my latest science explainers about the strong and weak nuclear forces. My book recommendation for this episode is... I really don't know. None of them did very much for me. I guess if I had to pick one of the ones I read, I'd pick Time Out of Joint, which has a fun mystery component to it that can help engage the reader. Maybe you'll like Dick's writing better than I did, but that's where I'd start. In the next episode, we have a special edition of this podcast. I will be interviewing a real author about their experience with science fiction and its history. In this first interview, I will be talking to Max Hawthorne, the Prince of Paleofiction, and author of the Jaws meets Jurassic Park thriller series Chronos Rising. Thanks for listening.